It was a late autumn afternoon when it all began. One of those days where the air carried a sharpness that promised winter's swift arrival. I remember standing in my kitchen, the soft hum of the kettle filling the silence. The pale sunlight slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden countertops. I leaned against the counter, tracing a finger absent-mindedly over a coffee ring. The kind of mark that feels oddly permanent despite its simplicity. Then my phone buzzed, a single insistent vibration that seemed almost alive with urgency. I reached for it, noticing my mother's name glowing on the screen. Strange. She rarely called this early, especially on weekdays. My thumb hovered over the screen before I tapped to answer. "Hi, Mom," I said, keeping my tone light. "What's up?" There was a pause on the other end, not unusual for her, but this silence felt different, thicker somehow. I could hear her, breathing, a little uneven, as if she were preparing for something. "Hi, honey," she began, her voice carrying that saccharine edge she used when she was about to say something I wouldn't like. "How's everything? How's Maya?" I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten involuntarily at the mention of my wife's name. My mother and Maya had always maintained a precarious truce, their relationship an uneasy balance of polite smiles and veiled comments. They weren't openly hostile, but there was a tension between them that neither seemed willing to address. "She's good," I replied cautiously. "We're good." "Why?" Another pause. The kettle clicked off in the background, the sudden silence amplifying my unease. "Well," she said, dragging the word out as if testing its weight, "I've been thinking about something, and I wanted to talk to you about it. But it's delicate." Delicate. That word sat in my chest like a shard of glass. I moved to the kettle, pouring water over the waiting tea bag, needing something to occupy my hands. "Okay," I said slowly. "What's going on?" There was a shift. In her tone then, a softening, but also a strange kind of insistence. "You know I only want what's best for you, right? For your happiness." "Mom," I interrupted, setting the kettle down with a clatter. "Just say it," she sighed, a long, exasperated breath that sent a shiver down my spine, and then she said it. "I think Maya should see someone else, just for a while, to, explore her options." For a moment, my brain refused to process her words. They hung in the air like smoke, twisting and impossible to grasp. "I'm sorry, what?" I asked, my voice sharp. I could feel the heat rising to my face, the tea suddenly forgotten in my grip. "I'm just saying," she continued, her tone oddly measured as though she had rehearsed this, "that sometimes people need to broaden their horizons. It might be good for both of you." My mind reeled. Was she suggesting what I thought she was? The idea was absurd, offensive, and yet here she was, calmly planting the seed of betrayal like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Mom," I said, my voice low and controlled, though my hands were trembling. "Do you even hear yourself right now? You're asking my wife, to cheat on me?" "I'm not saying cheat," she said quickly, as if that clarification would soften the blow. "I'm saying explore. There's a difference, and it's not like you'd have to know about it." The sheer audacity of her words left me momentarily speechless. I set the tea down, gripping the edge of the counter as though it might anchor me to reality. "Why would you even suggest something like that?" I asked finally, my voice cracking with a mix of disbelief and anger. What are you trying to do here?" She hesitated, but only briefly. "I just think Maya might feel trapped, and if she does, it's not fair to either of you. I'm looking out for you, sweetheart, for your future." I closed my eyes, taking a deep, measured breath. My mother's voice, once a source of comfort, now felt like an intruder, prying into the most sacred parts of my life. "You don't get to decide what's best for my marriage," I said, each word deliberate. "And you definitely don't get to plant ideas like this. What you're suggesting, it's wrong. It's disgusting." The silence on her end was deafening, but I didn't care. My thoughts were racing, memories of Maya flashing in my mind, her laugh, the way her hand fit perfectly in mine, the quiet moments when words weren't necessary. The very idea of her with someone else was like a knife twisting in my gut. "I think we're done here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Without waiting for her response, I hung up, my hand trembling as I placed the phone face down on the counter. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the steaming mug of tea as if it held the answers to questions I hadn't even thought to ask. My mother's words echoed in my mind, each syllable a betrayal I hadn't seen coming. The idea of revenge was a whisper at first, subtle and fleeting, like the flicker of a shadow in the corner of my mind. But as the days wore on, that whisper grew louder, feeding on my anger, my hurt, and the sheer audacity of my mother's suggestion. Revenge wasn't in my nature. Or at least, I'd always thought so. But betrayal has a way of reshaping you, sharpening your edges until you don't recognize the person staring back in the mirror. It started the night Maya and I went to dinner, at my parents' house. My mother acted as if our previous conversation had never happened, her demeanor unnervingly warm and doting. She complimented Maya's dress, her hair, even the way she laughed at one of my father's tired jokes. I could barely eat. Every bite tasted like ash as I watched her play the perfect hostess, a puppet master pulling strings while the rest of us danced unknowingly to her tune. Except I wasn't dancing. Not anymore. When the evening ended and we returned home, I lingered in the car after Maya went inside. The cold night air stung my skin, grounding me in the reality of what I was about to do. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for. Ben. Ben had been my best friend since college, though our paths had diverged in recent years. He was the kind of person who thrived in chaos, who wore his bad decisions like a badge of honor. If anyone could help me pull this off, it was him. The next day, I met Ben at a dive bar on the edge of town, the kind of place where anonymity was guaranteed. He leaned back in his chair, a beer in one hand and a smirk on his face as I laid out the situation. "So, let me get this straight," he said, his voice thick with disbelief. "Your mom tried to convince your wife to cheat on you?" "That's the gist of it," I said, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. "And now, I want her to feel what betrayal really looks like." Ben let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "Man, that's dark, but I'm in." It wasn't hard to convince him. Ben had always loved a good scheme, and this one was ripe for the taking. Together we hatched a plan, a calculated, meticulous act of vengeance that would leave no doubt about where my mother's meddling had led her. Phase 1 began with a simple text. "Hi, Mrs. Taylor. This is Christine. I think it's time we talk." Christine was a name I pulled out of thin air, but the message was enough to set my mother on edge. I imagined her reading it, the blood draining from her face as her carefully curated world began to crack. I waited exactly 24 hours before sending the next message. "I know everything. Let's meet. Tomorrow at 3, Café Soleil." Ben played his part perfectly, posing as Christine's cousin when my mother arrived at the cafe. From the window of my parked car, I watched as he slid an envelope across the table, his expression grim. My mother's hands shook as she opened it, her face contorting in confusion as she pulled out photos, doctored images of her with another man, intimate enough to be scandalous. Her reaction was everything I'd hoped for. She glanced around nervously, her eyes darting to the cafe's entrance as if someone might recognize her. The weight of those fabricated lies was already crushing her, and we weren't even close to finished. Phase 2 was more personal. That evening, I invited her to dinner at our house. A rare gesture on my part, but one she eagerly accepted, likely hoping to smooth over any lingering tension from our previous conversations. As we sat at the table, the atmosphere was almost too pleasant. Maya laughed at my jokes, my mother chimed in with compliments, and for a moment it felt like we were a normal family. But beneath the surface, I was seething, my mind racing with the final step of my plan. When dessert was served, I stood, raising my glass for a toast. To family, I said, my voice steady, and to trust. My mother smiled, raising her glass. In return, but the look in her eyes told me she knew something was coming. And speaking of trust, I continued, setting my glass down, I think it's time we cleared the air about a few things. I reached into my pocket, pulling out a small envelope and placing it on the table in front of her. Her smile faltered as she glanced at it, then back at me. "What's this?" she asked, her voice tight. "Open it," I said simply. Her hands trembled as she did, revealing a single photograph, one of the doctored images Ben and I had planted earlier. Her eyes widened in horror, and she looked up at me, her face pale. "I don't understand," she stammered. "You don't?" I said, my tone laced with feigned innocence. "Well, maybe it's time you did." Maya's gaze darted between us, confusion etched across her features. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. "You tried to destroy my marriage," I said, my voice rising. "You planted a seed of betrayal in the one place it never belonged." My mother stared at the photo, her hand trembling so violently that the paper slipped from her grasp and fluttered to the table. Her lips parted, but no words came. The silence was almost oppressive, stretching across the room like a shadow. Maya, seated next to me, was motionless, her confusion giving way to something sharper, something close to suspicion. I took a breath, my pulse thrumming in my ears. I hadn't anticipated this moment feeling so raw, so exposed. But there was no turning back. "Do you understand now, Mom?" I asked, my voice steady but low. "Do you see what it feels like to have someone twist the knife when you least expect it?" Her eyes snapped up to meet mine, wide and glassy. This isn't true," she stammered, her voice a thin thread of panic. "This is some kind of mistake." "There's no mistake," I cut in, my tone sharper than I intended. "You tried to plant doubt in my marriage, tried to convince Maya to betray me. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences?" Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no coherent response came. She looked utterly deflated, her usually unshakable demeanor crumbling under the weight of my accusations. Maya's voice broke the silence, quiet but firm. "Can someone explain what's going on?" she asked, her gaze fixed on me now, probing and relentless. I hesitated, the full force of her question pinning me in place. This was the moment I had dreaded most, the moment where my plan, no matter how justified, would be laid bare for her to see. The bitterness in my heart had driven me to this point, but now I had to face the fallout. I turned to her, my expression softening despite the turmoil inside me. "Maya," I began, my voice low, "there's something you need to know. A few weeks ago, Mom called me. She suggested that you explore other options, that maybe you should cheat on me." Maya blinked, her face an unreadable mask. For a moment I thought she hadn't heard me, but then her expression twisted into something I couldn't quite place. Shock, anger, and something deeper, something that made my stomach churn. "She what?" Maya's voice was sharp now, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. I nodded, swallowing hard. I didn't believe it at first either, but she said it, plain as day. And she didn't just stop there. She implied it would be good for us, that it might even help our marriage. Maya turned to my mother, her eyes blazing. "Is this true?" she demanded, her voice trembling with fury. "I was trying to help," my mother blurted, her composure cracking, like thin ice. "You've always seemed so restless. I thought maybe you weren't happy, that you needed to—" "Stop." Maya's voice was cold, her tone carrying a finality that silenced the room. "You don't get to decide what's best for us. You don't get to meddle in our marriage like it's some kind of experiment." I watched as Maya stood, her movements deliberate and restrained, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her anger. She looked down at my mother with a mixture of pity and disdain. "You've crossed a line you can't come back from." And then she turned to me. "And you," she said, her voice softer now but no less firm. "What is all this? What's with the photo? Did you orchestrate this?" I froze, the weight of her gaze almost unbearable. "I needed her to understand," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I needed her to feel what it's like to have someone betray your trust." Maya's eyes searched mine, her expression unreadable. For a moment I thought she might walk away, leave me standing there with nothing but the remnants of my revenge and the bitterness it had wrought. But instead, she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "This is all so messed up," she said, shaking her head. "I need some air." Without another word, she grabbed her coat and left, the door clicking softly behind her. The silence that followed was suffocating. My mother sat slumped in her chair, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. I leaned against the counter, my arms crossed tightly over my chest. "Are you happy now?" I asked, my voice cold. She looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed. "I was trying to protect you," she whispered. "Protect me?" I laughed bitterly. "You didn't protect me. You tried to destroy the one good thing I have in my life." Her face crumpled, but I didn't feel any satisfaction. The weight of what I'd done, the lengths I'd gone to, pressed down on me, heavy and unrelenting. When Maya returned hours later, the air between us was tense but quieter, like the calm after a storm. She didn't speak at first, just sat, across from me at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly together. "I love you," she said finally, her voice steady. "But this can't happen again. We can't let anyone come between us. Not your mom, not anyone." The following weeks were a haze of awkward silences, tense phone calls, and heavy-hearted conversations. Maya and I agreed on one thing above all. We needed space from my mother. For the first time in my life, I found myself placing firm boundaries where there had never been any before. The first time I called my mother to tell her we wouldn't be visiting for Sunday dinner, her reaction was as predictable as it was painful. "I don't understand," she said, her voice quivering on the other end of the line. "Is this because of that misunderstanding?" "Misunderstanding?" I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. "You tried to sabotage my marriage, Mom. That's not a misunderstanding, that's a betrayal." Her silence was deafening. I could almost hear her scrambling for a response, her mind working overtime to salvage what was left of our relationship. But I didn't give her the chance. "I need time," I said, my tone firm but not unkind. "Maya and I both do. Until then, I don't want to hear from you. Not unless it's an apology." And then I hung up, the weight of the call pressing down on me like a lead blanket. Cutting ties, even temporarily, was harder than I'd imagined, but it was necessary. Maya and I spent those weeks rebuilding what my mother had tried to tear apart. We talked, really talked, about everything. About trust, about boundaries, about the ways we'd both failed to protect our relationship from outside interference. Those conversations were raw and painful, but they were also healing. One night, as we sat together on the couch, Maya turned. To me, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think she meant well?" she asked, her voice soft. I considered the question for a long moment. "Maybe," I admitted. "But even if she did, it doesn't excuse what she did. There's a line between caring and controlling, and she crossed it." Maya nodded, her fingers brushing against mine. "I think we should see a counselor," she said. "Not because we're broken, but because we want to stay strong. Together." The suggestion surprised me, but it also made sense. We'd been through a storm, and while the skies were clearing, the damage was still there, lingering beneath the surface. I agreed, and we made an appointment the next day. Therapy was a revelation. It forced me to confront not just my mother's behavior, but my own complicity in allowing her to wield so much influence over my life. It helped me see patterns I'd been blind to, ways I'd let her control me without even realizing it. Our therapist, a kind but no-nonsense woman named Dr. Fields, didn't hold back. "Your mother's actions are her responsibility," she said during one session. "But your response to them is yours. You have to decide what kind of relationship you want with her and what you're willing to do to protect the relationship you have with Maya." That statement stayed with me, echoing in my mind long after the session ended. What kind of relationship did I want with my mother? Could I forgive her? Did I even want to? The answer came one Saturday morning, months later, when I found an envelope in our mailbox. It was from my mother, her handwriting neat and deliberate on the front. I hesitated before opening it, my heart pounding as I slid the letter out. The words inside were raw and unpolished, a stark contrast to her usual composed demeanor. "Dear son," it began, "I don't know where to start, except to say I'm sorry. Truly, deeply sorry. I've spent the past few months reflecting on everything, on the things I said, the choices I made, and the ways I hurt you and Maya. There's no excuse for what I did. I let my own fears and insecurities cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I betrayed your trust. I understand now that my actions were wrong, that I overstepped in ways I can't take back. I don't expect forgiveness. Not right away, and maybe not ever. But I hope, in time, we can find a way to move forward. I love you. I always have, and I always will. But I see now that love isn't enough. It has to come with respect. And I failed at that. I'll do better if you let me. I promise." The letter was signed simply, Mom. I read it twice, then a third time, my emotions swirling in a way I couldn't quite pin down. Anger, sadness, hope, all of it mixed together, leaving me feeling strangely weightless. When I showed the letter to Maya, she read it in silence, her expression unreadable. Finally, she looked up at me. "Do you believe her?" she asked. I thought about it for a moment before nodding. "I think she's trying," I said. "And that's a start." It wasn't an instant fix. Healing rarely is. But that letter marked the beginning of something new, a relationship built not on obligation, but on honesty and boundaries. It would take time, patience, and effort on both sides. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like it was possible. The weeks following my mother's letter were a delicate dance of cautious steps. I decided to meet her for coffee one afternoon, just the two of us. Maya supported the decision, though she made it clear that my mother's place in our lives would depend on her actions moving forward. When I walked into the cafe, my mother was already seated at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. She looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of her choices had physically diminished her. I hesitated at the threshold, a mix of emotions churning inside me, but then I forced myself to move forward. "Hi, Mom," I said as I sat down across from her. Her eyes lifted to meet mine, and for the first time in years, they didn't hold that unshakable certainty I'd grown so accustomed to. Instead, they were filled with something fragile, something human. "Hi," she said, her voice soft. "Thank you for coming." I nodded, folding my hands on the table. The silence stretched between us, heavy but not unbearable. I let her take the lead, curious to see what she would say. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she began, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. "About how I've treated you, about the ways I've interfered. I see now that I was wrong, and I can't tell you how sorry I am." Her words were sincere, but they didn't erase the hurt. Still, they were a start. "I appreciate that, Mom," I said, my tone measured. "But it's going to take time to rebuild the trust that was broken." She nodded, her expression somber. "I understand, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." We talked for nearly an hour about her fears, her regrets, and her determination to change. It was a conversation we should have had years ago, but I was grateful we were having it now. By the end of it, I felt something loosen inside me, a knot of anger and resentment that had been choking me for months. When I told Maya about the meeting later that evening, she listened intently, her gaze thoughtful. "It sounds like she's trying," she said, "but we need to protect what we have. That means setting clear boundaries." "I agree," I said. "She needs to earn her way back into our lives, not just expect it." We drafted a list of boundaries together, a blueprint for how we would move forward. It wasn't just about my mother. It was about us, about protecting the life we were building together. We agreed to keep her involvement in our lives limited at first, with no unannounced visits or unsolicited advice. Maya would join me for future meetings once she felt ready, but for now, it was important to take things slowly. Months passed, and true to her word, my mother respected our boundaries. She called less frequently, and when she did, it was never to pry or meddle. She even sent a heartfelt apology to Maya, acknowledging her actions and expressing her hope for a second chance. Maya was hesitant at first, but over time, she began to see the changes in my mother. She agreed to join me for a family dinner one evening, a milestone that felt both monumental and nerve-wracking. When we arrived at my mother's house, the atmosphere was different, quieter, softer. My mother greeted Maya with a warmth that felt genuine, not performative. And for the first time in what felt like forever, we shared a meal without tension simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness, of old wounds peeking through. But it was progress, and that was enough. One night, as Maya and I sat together on the porch, watching the stars blink into existence, she turned to me with a smile. "You know," she said, "for all the chaos we went through, I think it made us stronger. I feel closer to you now than I ever have." I took her hand in mine, the warmth of her touch grounding me. "Me too," I said, "and I'm not going to let anyone come between us again. Ever." She leaned her head against my shoulder, and we sat there in comfortable silence, the past fading into the background as the future stretched out before us. It wasn't the storybook resolution I might have hoped for, but it was real. Life doesn't tie itself into neat little bows, and relationships are messy, complicated, and full of imperfections. But they're also worth fighting for. And as I held Maya's hand that night, I knew we had something worth fighting for, a love that had been tested and had emerged stronger, brighter, and unbreakable. The months of gradual reconciliation passed, and life began to settle into a new normal. Maya and I had found a rhythm again, and while the scars of what had happened still lingered, they no longer defined our days. My mother, true to her promise, was careful with her words and actions, and for the first time, it felt like she was genuinely trying to respect the boundaries we had set. But life, as it often does, had other plans. One evening, I came home to find Maya sitting at the dining table, her laptop open and a stack of papers spread out around her. She looked up as I walked in, her expression unreadable. "Hey," I said, setting down my keys. "What's all this?" Maya closed her laptop and motioned for me to sit. "I've been doing some digging," she said, her tone steady but laced with tension. "I wasn't looking for anything specific, but I found something you need to see." I sat down, my heart already sinking at the gravity in her voice. She slid a single document across the table toward me. It was a printed email, dated months earlier, shortly after the incident that had shaken our lives. As I scanned the text, my chest tightened. It was an email from my mother to someone I didn't recognize. The language was clinical, almost transactional, but the intent was clear. She had hired a private investigator to gather information on Maya's background and activities. The words felt like a punch to the gut. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Maya leaned forward, her expression a mix of hurt and determination. I didn't want to believe it, but it's real. I cross-checked the investigator's details and everything checks out. Your mother was digging into my past, trying to find something to use against me. My mind raced, a storm of emotions crashing over me. Anger, disbelief, betrayal. I thought we had turned a corner, that my mother had changed. But this was something else entirely. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, my voice cracking. Maya hesitated, then said, "Because I wanted to be sure. I didn't want to accuse her without proof. And honestly, I didn't know if I could handle what it might mean for us." I reached across the table and took her hand in mine. "This doesn't change anything between us," I said firmly. "You're my wife. You're my family. Nothing she does can change that." Maya's eyes softened, but the pain lingered. "What are you going to do?" she asked. The next day, I called my mother and asked to meet her. When I arrived at her house, she greeted me with a cautious smile, as if sensing the storm brewing beneath my calm exterior. We sat in the living room, the silence heavy between us. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I know about the investigator," I said, my voice cold and steady. Her face fell, the color draining from her cheeks. I can explain," she stammered. "Explain what?" I snapped, the anger I had been holding, back finally breaking free. "That after everything, after you promised to respect my marriage, you still couldn't help yourself? That you went behind my back and tried to find something to use against Maya? Do you have any idea what that's done to her, to us?" Tears welled in her eyes, but they did little to soften the fury burning in my chest. "I thought I was protecting you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought if I could find something, anything, it would prove—" "Prove what?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "That she's not good enough for me? That you know better than I do what's best for my life? Do you even hear yourself?" She broke down then, her sobs filling the room. "I was wrong," she said over and over. "I was so wrong." I let her cry, my own emotions a volatile mix of anger and sorrow. When she finally looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, I said, "This has to stop, Mom. If you ever want to be a part of my life, our life, you have to let go of your control, your doubts, your need to interfere. This is it. There are no more second chances." Her nod was small, tentative. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice trembling. "I just don't want to lose you. Rebuilding trust this time was even harder." Maya and I agreed that my mother's involvement in our lives would remain limited for the foreseeable future. She would have to earn her place, step by careful step. And while I hoped she could change, I also knew I couldn't let her actions dictate my happiness anymore. Through it all, Maya stood by me, her strength and resilience a constant reminder of why I had chosen her in the first place. Together, we weathered the fallout, emerging on the other side stronger and more united than ever. In the end, love isn't about perfection, it's about choice. And I chose Maya, every single day. The weeks following my confrontation with my mother were quiet but charged with an underlying tension. It was as though the universe held its breath, waiting to see if the fragile threads of reconciliation could withstand the weight of her betrayal. Maya and I, however, had stopped waiting. We were moving forward, carving out a life defined by our choices, not anyone else's. One evening, Maya and I decided to host a small gathering at our home, a sort of reclamation of our space and our joy. We invited close friends, people who had supported us through the turmoil, and even extended an olive branch to my mother. It was a cautious step, but one we felt was necessary to test the waters of her sincerity. When the evening arrived, the house was alive with laughter and the hum of conversation. Maya had outdone herself with the food and decorations, her knack for creating warmth and beauty shining through in every detail. I couldn't help but admire her as she flitted between guests, her smile genuine, her laughter infectious. She was the heart of our home, the anchor that kept us steady. My mother arrived late, a small bouquet of flowers in hand. She looked hesitant as she stepped inside, her eyes darting around the room until they landed on me. I greeted her with a nod and a polite smile, but the walls between us were still intact. "Thank you for inviting me," she said softly, handing me the flowers. "Thank you for coming," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. She moved through the room, like someone navigating a minefield, careful not to overstep. To her credit, she stayed in the background, engaging politely with guests and avoiding any pointed conversations with Maya. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Later that night, after the last guest had left, Maya and I sat together, in the quiet aftermath of the evening. The house was dimly lit, the remnants of the party scattered around us. She leaned her head on my shoulder, her exhaustion tempered by a contented smile. "She behaved herself," Maya said, her tone light but thoughtful. "She did," I agreed. "It's a start." Maya lifted her head to look at me, her eyes searching mine. "Do you think she can really change?" I considered her question carefully. "I think people can change, but it's not easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. She has a long way to go, but tonight felt like progress." Maya nodded, her expression contemplative. "As long as we're on the same page," she said, taking my hand in hers. "I won't let her or anyone come between us again." "You won't have to," I assured her. "We're in this together, always." Life moved on, not in a dramatic transformation, but in the slow, steady way that real growth often does. My mother continued to keep her distance, respecting the boundaries we had set. She attended family events, but always with an air of caution, as if afraid of saying or doing the wrong thing. It was strange, seeing her so subdued, but it also gave me hope that she was finally beginning to understand the consequences of her actions. Maya and I, meanwhile, flourished. Our marriage, once tested by fire, had emerged stronger, tempered by the trials we had faced. We found joy in the little things, a quiet morning together, a shared laugh over a silly joke, the simple comfort of knowing we were each other's safe harbor. One day, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Maya turned to me with a smile. "I've been thinking," she said, her tone playful. "Maybe it's time we added someone new to the family." I raised an eyebrow, caught off guard. "You mean—" She nodded, her smile widening. "I think I'm ready. Are you?" The thought of starting a family had always been a distant dream, something we had talked about in abstract terms. But now, sitting there with her hand in mine, it felt real. It felt right. "I'm ready," I said, my voice steady with conviction. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Our story wasn't perfect, but it was ours, shaped by the choices we had made and the love we had fought to protect, and in that moment I knew we were just getting started. The decision to start a family became a beacon of hope for Maya and me, a new chapter to explore together. It gave us a focus beyond the struggles of the past, a future filled with possibility. We approached it with the same teamwork that had gotten us through everything else, researching, planning, and dreaming about what our lives could look like with a little one in the picture. But as we began this new journey, life, as always, proved unpredictable. A few weeks after our decision, my mother reached out to me asking to meet. Her request came with an uncharacteristic tone of humility, and despite my reservations, I agreed. I chose a neutral location, a quiet cafe near the park, to keep the interaction casual and on neutral ground. When I arrived, she was already seated, nervously stirring her coffee. She looked up as I approached, her eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and trepidation. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. I nodded, sitting across from her. "What's on your mind?" She hesitated, as if gathering the courage to speak. Finally, she said, "I've been doing a lot of thinking, about everything, about you and Maya, and about myself." I remained silent, letting her continue. "I realize now how much I hurt you," she said, her voice trembling, "and how much I underestimated the strength of your relationship. I was wrong to interfere, wrong to try to control things the way I did." Her words felt genuine, but I had learned to be cautious. "What brought this on?" I asked, my tone measured. She gave a small, rueful smile. "Seeing you both together at the party, the way you look at each other, it's undeniable. I can see how much you love her, and I know now that nothing I do or say can change that. Nor should it." Her admission was unexpected, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope that she might truly be changing. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight," she continued, "but I want to earn your trust back. And Maya's. If you'll let me." Her vulnerability caught me off guard. I studied her face, searching for any sign of manipulation, but all I saw was sincerity. "I appreciate what you're saying," I said carefully, "but trust isn't something you can rush. It takes time and consistency. If you're serious about this, it has to be real. No half measures." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I understand, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." True to her word, my mother began making small but meaningful efforts to rebuild our relationship. She reached out to Maya directly, apologizing in a heartfelt letter that acknowledged her actions without making excuses. It was a gesture that Maya appreciated, even if it didn't immediately erase the pain. Over time, my mother also started attending therapy, a step I never thought I'd see her take. She shared updates with me occasionally, not to seek praise, but to let me know she was working on herself. It was a slow process, but it felt genuine. Meanwhile, Maya and I continued to prepare for our future. We spent weekends painting the spare room, transforming it into a cozy nursery with soft, neutral colors and whimsical animal decals. Each brushstroke felt like a declaration of hope, a promise to the little one who would eventually fill the space with laughter and life. One evening, as we were putting the finishing touches on the room, Maya turned to me with a playful smile. "You know," she said, holding up a tiny onesie she had just unpacked, "this makes it all feel real." I smiled, pulling her into my arms. "It is real, and it's going to be amazing." The months passed, and Maya and I grew closer than ever, united by our shared dream. My mother, too, continued to surprise us with her growth. She became a quieter presence in our lives, supportive but not overbearing. She even joined us for a family dinner one evening, engaging with Maya in a way that felt natural and unforced. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, and the wounds of the past hadn't entirely healed. But for the first time, it felt like we were all moving forward together. Then came the day that changed everything. Maya and I were sitting in the living room, sharing a quiet evening when her phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at the screen and froze. "What is it?" I asked, concern creeping into my voice. She turned the phone toward me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and excitement. "It's from the adoption agency," she said. "They've matched us with a baby." Time seemed to stand still as the words sank in. I took the phone from her, reading the message for myself. It was real. It was happening. Maya let out a laugh that was half sob, throwing her arms around me. "We're going to be parents," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. I held her close, my own tears falling freely. In that moment, every struggle, every heartbreak, every triumph felt like it had led us to this point. The days following the adoption agency's call were a whirlwind of emotion and preparation. Maya and I were ecstatic, but beneath the excitement was a quiet undercurrent of nervousness. Would we be good parents? Were we ready for this monumental change? Every thought carried equal parts anticipation and self-doubt, but together we faced each moment, leaning on each other for strength. The baby, a beautiful little girl, was only 6 weeks old. Her name, the agency told us, was Isla. The name felt like a song on my tongue, simple and serene. When we saw her picture for the first time, a tiny bundle with curious eyes and a shock of dark hair, it was as if the universe whispered, "She's yours." The day we met Isla was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. The agency had arranged for us to spend the afternoon with her at their facility before taking her home. As we entered the room, my heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing the enormity of the moment. Maya's hand tightened around mine as we stepped inside. The room was warm and filled with the soft hum of baby laughter. In the corner, a caretaker stood beside a bassinet, rocking it gently. Then I saw her, tiny, delicate, and perfect. "Would you like to hold her?" the caretaker asked, her voice kind. Maya nodded, tears already glistening in her eyes. The caretaker carefully placed Isla into her arms, and I watched as Maya cradled her for the first time. The transformation was immediate. Maya's entire being seemed to soften, her face alight with an expression I had never seen before. Pure, unfiltered love. "She's beautiful," Maya whispered, her voice trembling. She looked up at me, her eyes overflowing. "Do you want to hold her?" I hesitated, suddenly aware of the weight of this moment. But when Maya gently placed Isla in my arms, the world seemed to fall away. She was so small, so fragile. Her tiny hand curled instinctively around my finger, and I felt an overwhelming surge of protectiveness, love, and awe. "Hi, Isla," I murmured, my voice barely audible. "I'm your dad." The words felt strange and wonderful, like a new skin I was learning to wear. Isla blinked up at me with wide, curious eyes, and in that instant, I knew I would do anything for her. Bringing Isla home was a mixture of chaos and magic. The nursery we had so carefully prepared now felt alive, every corner filled with the promise of her presence. There were sleepless nights and moments of uncertainty, but there was also joy in its purest form. Isla's laughter became the soundtrack of our days, her every coo and giggle a reminder of why we had fought so hard to build this life. Maya was a natural mother, patient and nurturing in ways that left me in awe. I found myself learning from her, watching the way she soothed Isla with a soft hum or calmed her cries with a gentle touch. But more than anything, we were a team, sharing every diaper change, every midnight feeding, and every precious milestone. My mother's role in our new life was delicate but meaningful. She approached Isla with the same caution she had shown toward us, never overstepping but always eager to help. I could see the effort it took for her to hold back, to respect the boundaries we had set. But there was also genuine love in her actions. The way she knitted tiny blankets for Isla, the care she took in choosing gifts that were thoughtful rather than extravagant. One afternoon, as I watched her rocking Isla in the nursery, humming a lullaby I hadn't heard since childhood, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step toward it. Seeing her with my daughter, so gentle and vulnerable, reminded me that people could change, even if the process was messy and imperfect. Life settled into a new rhythm, each day a blend of challenges and joys. Isla became the center of our world, her presence a constant reminder of the love that had brought us here. Maya and I grew even closer, our bond deepened by the shared experience of parenthood. One evening, as we sat together on the couch with Isla asleep in Maya's arms, I found myself reflecting on everything that had led us to this point. The betrayals, the heartache, the fights. They had all been painful, but they had also shaped us, strengthened us, and brought us to this beautiful, messy, extraordinary life. We did it, I said softly, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from Maya's face. She looked up at me, her eyes shimmering with the light of 1,000 unspoken emotions. We did, she agreed, and it was worth every single step. As I held them both close, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. Our story wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was ours. A story of love, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds that tied us together. And in that moment, I knew. No matter what the future held, we would face it as a family. The days following the adoption agency's call were a whirlwind of emotion and preparation. Maya and I were ecstatic, but beneath the excitement was a quiet undercurrent of nervousness. Would we be good parents? Were we ready for this monumental change? Every thought carried equal parts anticipation and self-doubt. But together, we faced each moment, leaning on each other for strength. The baby, a beautiful little girl, was only 6 weeks old. Her name, the agency told us, was Isla. The name felt like a song on my tongue, simple and serene. When we saw her picture for the first time, a tiny bundle with curious eyes and a shock of dark hair, it was as if the universe whispered, "She's yours." The day we met Isla was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. The agency had arranged for us to spend the afternoon with her at their facility before taking her home. As we entered the room, my heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing the enormity of the moment. Maya's hand tightened around mine as we stepped inside. The room was warm and filled with the soft hum of baby laughter. In the corner, a caretaker stood beside a bassinet, rocking it gently. Then I saw her, tiny, delicate, and perfect. "Would you like to hold her?" the caretaker asked, her voice kind. Maya nodded, tears already glistening in her eyes. The caretaker carefully placed Isla into her arms, and I watched as Maya cradled her for the first time. The transformation was immediate. Maya's entire being seemed to soften, her face alight with an expression I had never seen before. Pure, unfiltered love. "She's beautiful," Maya whispered, her voice trembling. She looked up at me, her eyes overflowing. "Do you want to hold her?" I hesitated, suddenly aware of the weight of this moment. But when Maya gently placed Isla in my arms, the world seemed to fall away. She was so small, so fragile. Her tiny hand curled instinctively around my finger, and I felt an overwhelming surge of protectiveness, love, and awe. "Hi, Isla," I murmured, my voice barely audible. "I'm your dad." The words felt strange and wonderful, like a new skin I was learning to wear. Isla blinked up at me with wide, curious eyes, and in that instant I knew I would do anything for her. Bringing Isla home was a mixture of chaos and magic. The nursery we had so carefully prepared now felt alive, every corner filled with the promise of her presence. There were sleepless nights and moments of uncertainty, but there was also joy in its purest form. Isla's laughter became the soundtrack of our days, her every coo and giggle a reminder of why we had fought so hard to build this life. Maya was a natural mother, patient and nurturing in ways that left me in awe. I found myself learning from her, watching the way she soothed Isla with a soft hum or calmed her cries with a gentle touch. But more than anything, we were a team, sharing every diaper change, every midnight feeding, and every precious milestone. My mother's role in our new life was delicate but meaningful. She approached Isla with the same caution she had shown toward us, never overstepping, but always eager to help. I could see the effort it took for her to hold back, to respect the boundaries we had set. But there was also genuine love in her actions, the way she knitted tiny blankets for Isla, the care she took in choosing gifts that were thoughtful rather than extravagant. One afternoon, as I watched her rocking Isla in the nursery, humming a lullaby I hadn't heard since childhood, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step toward it. Seeing her with my daughter, so gentle and vulnerable, reminded me that people could change, even if the process was messy and imperfect. Life settled into a new rhythm, each day a blend of challenges and joys. Isla became the center of our world, her presence a constant reminder of the love that had brought us here. Maya and I grew even closer, our bond deepened by the shared experience of parenthood. One evening, as we sat together on the couch with Isla asleep in Maya's arms, I found myself reflecting on everything that had led us to this point. The betrayals, the heartache, the fights, they had all been painful, but they had also shaped us, strengthened us, and brought us to this beautiful, messy, extraordinary life. "We did it," I said softly, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from Maya's face. She looked up at me, her eyes shimmy. The months passed in a blur of milestones and moments so small they almost went unnoticed, except we noticed them. Isla's first smile, the tiny gurgle of laughter when Maya tickled her toes, the way she reached for us with her chubby little hands as if we were her whole world. Our lives revolved around her, but amidst the sleepless nights and early mornings, there was an undeniable rhythm of joy. Isla gave us purpose, and with her, every challenge felt surmountable. The months that followed Isla's second birthday were both a continuation of our peaceful rhythm and a reminder that life was never quite as simple as we wanted it to be. But still, there was a beauty in the uncertainty, the way we all learned, together, to navigate the unpredictable twists that came our way. Isla had blossomed into a curious, adventurous little girl. Her language skills were improving rapidly, and she was now stringing words together in complete sentences, often surprising us with how much she understood of the world around her. Maya and I reveled in her early steps, her wide eyes of wonder, as she discovered new things, her contagious laughter whenever I made funny faces. There were moments when I would catch myself just staring at her, watching her play with her toys, or watching Maya chase after her in the park. And I'd be struck by the overwhelming thought, this is my life. This is the family I fought for. But even in the warmth of those moments, the past didn't quite let go. It had been a while since I'd seen my father. We'd lost touch when I was in my teens, and though my mom and I had worked through our issues, my relationship with him was still a complicated knot I hadn't dared to untangle. But a phone call one evening brought everything rushing to the surface. It was a simple message left on my voicemail. "I think we need to talk." My heart clenched as I listened to his voice, aged, tired, but still carrying that same gravelly tone I remembered from years ago. A rush of emotions hit me all at once. Anger, resentment, a fear of opening old wounds. Still, something about his voice made me hesitate. Maybe it was the fact that I had never truly given myself the chance to process our estrangement, or maybe it was the slow realization that I didn't want to leave any more chapters unfinished. The next week, I arranged to meet him at a small cafe near the outskirts of town. The place was quiet, tucked away from the main roads, and I hoped it would provide us with the kind of privacy we needed to speak freely. I arrived early, my thoughts running in circles. What would he say? What would I say? Could we possibly heal after all these years of silence? And then he walked in. He looked older than I remembered, gray in his hair, his face etched with lines that spoke of time passing in ways he hadn't expected. His eyes, though, still carried the same sharpness, the same intensity. He spotted me almost immediately, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The weight of years hung between us like a heavy curtain, both of us unsure how to pull it back. Finally, he made the first step. His hand extended toward me, stiffly, but still. "Hey, son." "Hey," I replied, my voice thick with the strangest blend of confusion and recognition. I shook his hand, the gesture foreign yet somehow familiar. We sat down across from each other, the awkwardness of the moment thick in the air. For a long while, neither of us spoke. I could feel the tension, the history between us, pulsing with every silent second. Finally, he broke the quiet. "I don't know where to start." I swallowed, my throat dry. "Start wherever you need to. But I won't lie to you, Dad. I don't know how I feel about this. About us." He nodded, as if he'd been expecting this. "I know. I've thought a lot about that too. And I know I can't undo the years I've lost. I didn't know how to be a father. Hell, I still don't. But I want to try. I don't want to leave this story unfinished." I studied him, searching for any trace of the man I had once known. The man who had walked away when I needed him the most. The man who had never quite been present, no matter how much I had longed for his approval. But as I looked at him now, I saw something different. The cracks in his facade, the vulnerability that he hadn't shown before. He wasn't perfect. He never would be. But maybe he was trying. Maybe that was enough. "I don't know if I can just forgive and forget, Dad," I said, the words heavy. "But I'm not willing to close this door either, not for Isla's sake, not for yours. Maybe we can start with something small, build it from there." His expression softened, relief washing over him. "I'll take what I can get. I've got time." We spent the next couple of hours talking about nothing and everything. We laughed at old memories, spoke of regrets, and for the first time in my life, I listened to my father speak of his own struggles with the kind of honesty I'd never heard before. The conversation didn't heal all the wounds, but it was a step, a beginning. That night I returned home to Maya and Isla, feeling strangely lighter. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a beginning, and that was something I had not expected. The past wasn't a place I could return to, but it was a part of me, and I needed to understand it before I could move fully into the future. Maya noticed the change in me as soon as I walked in. The weeks that followed the conversation with my father were quiet, but in the best way possible. There was no sudden, grand revelation, no dramatic shifts in the dynamic between us. Instead, it was a gradual shift, like the subtle rise of the tide, almost imperceptible, but undeniably present. We had dinner together once, just the two of us, at the same cafe where we had met. It felt strangely natural, almost like I had always known it was possible, even if I had never dared to hope. We talked more, Not about the past, but about the present. He asked about Maya and Isla, about our life, and there was something different in his voice when he spoke of them, a respect, a curiosity. He even asked if he could help with anything, as if offering to be a part of this new chapter I was writing, one that included him, but with clear boundaries. I couldn't help but wonder what had shifted in him. Had it been age, regret, the years alone, or was it the realization that time was not infinite, that he didn't have the luxury of waiting any longer to be the father I had always needed? Still, I found myself unsure of how to process it. How do you rebuild trust with someone who had let you down when you were most vulnerable? Could I accept the fragments of a relationship that had never fully been formed? And then there was Maya. We had always been close, Maya and I. Our bond, forged through years of shared experiences and mutual understanding, had only deepened as we raised Isla together. Yet, as we moved forward, I couldn't help but sense a quiet distance between us. It wasn't anything she said or did. It was more in the small moments that passed unnoticed. The way she'd sigh when I left the room. The way her smile didn't reach her eyes quite the same way anymore. One evening, after Isla had gone to bed, I found her standing by the window, looking out into the night. The pale glow of the streetlight reflected off her face, giving her an almost ethereal quality. "Maya?" I called gently, stepping closer. She didn't turn at first, as if lost in her thoughts. "Hmm?" I waited, sensing the weight of whatever she was carrying. "You okay?" She didn't respond right away. Then, after a beat, she nodded, but her voice was thick with unspoken words. I don't know, it's like things are changing, you know?" "Things are always changing," I said, moving to stand next to her. "You know that. It's part of the deal." "I know," she replied softly. "But this feels different. You've changed too. And I can't tell if it's for the better or if I'm just losing you in a way I didn't expect." Her words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they held a truth I hadn't been able to. See? We had spent so much time fighting for the future, for Isla, that I hadn't noticed how much of myself I had been giving away in the process. "Maya," I whispered, reaching out to touch her arm. "What are you really saying?" She turned, meeting my gaze, her eyes full of vulnerability. "I'm scared. Scared of losing you to all of this, to your past, to your father, to whatever's next. And I don't know how to make you see that I need you here. With me. With us." I let her words hang in the air for a moment, feeling the weight of them settle into the space between us. The old me would have bristled, would have pulled away. But the man I was now, the father, the partner, I couldn't do that. Not anymore. Not when the one person who had stood by me through everything was speaking her truth. "I didn't realize how much I've been pulled into all of this," I said slowly, my voice raw. "Into the past, into trying to fix what I thought was broken. But I see you, Maya. I see you, and I need you. Not just as the mother of our child, but as the woman I love." Her eyes softened, and she stepped closer, her hand resting on my chest right over my heart. "I know you love me," she whispered. "But I need more than that. I need to feel like I'm here too. Not just as the person who's always been here, but as the woman who still matters to you, to us." My throat tightened at the raw honesty in her voice, and I realized in that moment just how much I had neglected her needs in my quest to fix everything else. I had been so focused on the pieces of the past, trying to reconstruct them, that I hadn't stopped to rebuild the connection that had always been the foundation of my world. Maya. "I promise," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you go. I won't let us go." She looked at me, searching my eyes for the sincerity in my words, and I knew, deep down, that we had reached a turning point. Not just with my father, but with ourselves, with our marriage, with the way we were building our future together. The weeks that followed were a slow, steady return to each other. We worked through our fears, our doubts, and our needs with honesty and patience. As the days drifted by, the sense of newfound stability in our home seemed to settle like a warm blanket, enveloping me with the comfort I hadn't realized I was missing. Isla's laughter became a soundtrack to our lives, a reminder of everything worth fighting for. Maya and I, though never fully healed, found ourselves navigating the currents of our relationship with more understanding, more patience than we had before. But in the midst of this peace, there were still moments, small, fleeting, that I couldn't shake. Fragments of old memories, questions that lingered, and shadows of the past that refused to be entirely left behind. I found myself revisiting the phone call I had received from my father. There was something unsettling about it, something I couldn't quite place. He had spoken of change, of wanting to be a part of my life, but was it genuine? Or was it just another attempt to seek redemption after years of silence? I hadn't been able to fully reconcile my feelings, and despite the progress we had made in our conversations, a part of me couldn't help but remain cautious. And so, when my phone buzzed one evening, a number I didn't recognize flashing on the screen, my heart skipped a beat. I hesitated for a moment, then answered. "Hello?" It was him. My father's voice, rough and hesitant as always, but this time tinged with something else, urgency. "I need to talk to you. It's important." The knot in my stomach tightened. I had promised myself that I would keep things open between us, that I would allow space for the relationship to grow, but there was something about his tone, something that didn't sit right. "What's going on?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, though inside, my mind raced with possibilities. "I can't explain it all right now," he said quickly, "but there's something I need to tell you. Something you need to know." I closed my eyes, the weight of his words pressing against my chest. This wasn't just a casual conversation, it was something more, something heavy. "I'll be there in an hour," I said before I could second-guess myself. I didn't know why I said it. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was a lingering hope that maybe, just maybe, I would get the closure I had been seeking for so long. When I arrived at his house, the familiar sense of unease gripped me once more. The house looked exactly as I remembered, run down, the lawn overgrown with weeds, the paint peeling from the porch. The door opened before I could knock, and my father stood in the frame, his face pale and drawn. "You came," he said quietly, stepping aside to let me in. "I didn't know if you would." I followed him into the dimly lit living room, the air thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and old furniture. It felt as though nothing had changed in this place. Not the atmosphere, not the tension, not the years of silence that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. "What's going on, Dad?" I asked, my voice low, barely above a whisper. The unease had settled deep in my bones, and I couldn't shake it. He motioned for me to sit down, and I complied, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. He took a long breath before speaking, his hands trembling slightly as he wrung them together. "You know I haven't been completely honest with you," he began, his eyes never meeting mine. "About a lot of things. But there's one thing you deserve to know." My pulse quickened. I didn't know where this was going, but my gut was telling me it wasn't going to be good. "There's a reason I walked away," he continued, his voice cracking. "A reason I couldn't be the father you needed." I leaned forward, suddenly all ears. "What do you mean? Why?" He sighed heavily, his hands shaking even more now. "It's complicated, but it's something you need to understand." The silence between us stretched, thick and uncomfortable, until he finally spoke again. "I wasn't just running from my responsibilities. I was running from your mother." I blinked, confusion clouding my thoughts. "What do you mean?" "She asked me to do something," he said, his voice so quiet I had to strain to hear him. "Something I couldn't live with." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What? What did she ask you to do?" His gaze flicked up to mine, and for the first time in this conversation, I saw a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. Was it guilt? Fear? Shame? "She asked me to make a choice," he said slowly. "Between her and you. She wanted me to leave you." My mind reeled. I could hardly process his words. My mother had asked him to leave me, to abandon me completely. "I thought it was a test," he continued, his voice growing more strained. "But it wasn't. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't walk away from you. But I wasn't strong enough to face her either. So I chose the easiest option. I left. I felt like I'd been slapped across the face. The air in that small living room grew suffocating, thick with the weight of everything that had been unsaid for so long. My father's admission hung between us, suffocating and raw, like an open wound I wasn't sure how to close. I could hear the slow, steady thrum of my heart in my ears, a drumbeat echoing the confusion and rage that churned in my chest. I blinked, trying to process what he had said, trying to find my footing in the mess of emotions that had suddenly burst open like a dam. My mother made him leave me? The thought rattled through my mind, repeating like a broken record until it lost all meaning. How was I supposed to reconcile that with the woman I had known? The woman who had told me bedtime stories, who had kissed my scraped knees, who had sworn that family was everything. "Are you telling me," I said, my voice trembling but firm, "that my mother, your wife, asked you to leave me and you did?" My words felt foreign, as though they were coming from someone else. He looked at me, his gaze heavy with regret and sorrow, and nodded slowly. His shoulders slumped under the weight of it all. "I didn't want to hurt you, son. I didn't know how to make it right. I thought I could come back, make it better, but it was too late. She had made her decision. I didn't have the strength to fight her, to stand up for us." I stood up abruptly, pacing around the room as I tried to force the swirling thoughts in my mind into some kind of order. My hands shook as I ran them. Through my hair, my breaths coming shallow. How could you let her do that to me?" The words ripped from my chest before I could stop them. My voice cracked and I hated the way it sounded, like a child lost in the storm of a grown-up world. "I was weak," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I was weak, and I couldn't fight her. I should have tried harder, but I didn't. I walked away from you because it was easier than standing up for what was right." Easier. I closed my eyes, the words slamming into me like a punch to the gut. Easier. The choice he had made, had it really been easier? Or had it been a choice? Driven by fear, by his own unresolved pain? The thought of him, a man who had never been strong enough to stand up for me, sent a fresh wave of bitterness coursing through my veins. I turned to face him, my eyes narrowing, a question bubbling up in me that had been years in the making. "What about us? What about me? What kind of man abandons his child because it's easier than facing the truth? What kind of father does that?" He flinched at my words, his face going pale. "I can't undo what I did. I know that. But I'm here now. I want to make it right, at least as much as I can." I let out a sharp laugh, bitter and dark. "Make it right? How? How do you make up for 20 years of nothing, of being a ghost in my life, of leaving me with nothing but her? And even then, I don't know who she really was. I don't know who any of you really were." The air seemed to freeze, my father's face crumpling under the weight of my anger. And I couldn't stop myself. I didn't want to stop myself. This was the release I had been craving. The raw honesty of everything that had been hidden, festering in the corners of my mind. The lies, the betrayal, the absence. "Don't you dare tell me you're trying to fix this," I said, my voice low and dangerous now. "You've had 20 years. You don't get to walk in and just say, 'I'm here now.' It's too late for that. It's too late for all of it." I could see the pain flash in his eyes, but it only fueled my fury. There was nothing he could say now, no explanation that could bridge the years that had been lost. And deep down, a part of me realized that no matter how much I wanted to believe in reconciliation, there was a part of me that would never forgive him for abandoning me, for allowing me to grow up in that emptiness. "I'm sorry," he said, again his voice breaking, the apology so weak it barely reached me. "I know it doesn't mean anything now, but I am." It was as if he was speaking to a ghost, as if the man sitting before me wasn't my father anymore, but a shadow of someone I had wanted him to be. My fingers curled into fists at my sides, but I didn't know what to do with them. I couldn't hit him, not physically, not after everything that had happened, but my words felt like daggers and I threw them without hesitation. "I don't want your apology," I spat, the bitterness in my voice sharp and unforgiving. "I don't want anything from you." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched on, suffocating and cold, the space between us filled with things we hadn't said. My chest ached with the weight of it all. The betrayal, the loss, the anger. It was all still there, tangled and raw. But there was something else, something I hadn't expected, a deep, gnawing sorrow that I couldn't shake. Because despite everything, I still wanted, needed answers.